Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we're journeying to the Middle Ages, a time when even a simple cough could carry a whisper of death. But before we settle in, a small favor. If you enjoy these calming videos, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps our little channel grow and keeps the stories flowing. And I'd love to know where in the world are you drifting off from tonight. Drop a comment below, and let's keep building this quiet global community. Now, take a deep breath. Let the tension melt away. Dim the lights and let your body soften as we slip into the stillness of the past and explore just how fragile life was before the miracles of modern medicine. Imagine being born into a world where the odds are already against you. You arrive in a smoky, dimly lit home, no doctors, no sterile instruments, just the trembling hands of a midwife. If the umbilical cord wraps the wrong way, or the labor is too long, you might not make it through your first day. And if you do, you've only survived the first of many trials. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. In some places, up to 1 in 3 babies didn't survive beyond their first year. Those who did live past infancy entered a world teeming with invisible threats, bacteria and viruses, not yet known to science. A scratch from a rusty tool could lead to tetanus. A rotting tooth might invite infection into your bloodstream. Coughing up blood was seen as a sign of bad humors or divine punishment, not tuberculosis or pneumonia. Germ theory was centuries away. The very idea of cleanliness as healthful hadn't yet taken root. Water so essential, so simple, was a danger in itself. Rivers were often used for both drinking and dumping waste. With no understanding of contamination, townspeople would draw water just downstream of where their neighbors emptied chamber pots. The result? Waves of dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. These diseases ravaged communities, often in silence, taking lives without a name for what was killing them. And then there was plague, the Black Death. A silent killer carried by fleas on rats, which swept through towns like a scythe. Entire villages vanished. Priests refused to give last rites. Parents abandoned children. Death became so common that people stopped burying their dead properly. Bells tolled endlessly. In some regions, half the population vanished in a matter of months. If illness didn't find you, hunger might. Famines were frequent. A few weeks of bad weather could destroy a harvest. Without refrigeration, there was no long-term food storage. People ate moldy bread, which sometimes carried hallucinogenic fungi like ergot causing fits, seizures, even death. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, turning minor ailments into fatal episodes. There were no vitamins, no supplements, no understanding of deficiency, only prayers and potions. Those lucky enough to reach adulthood, especially women, still faced deadly odds. Childbirth was one of the most common causes of death for women. There were no epidurals, no C-sections, no antibiotics for postnatal infections. A breech birth or a retained placenta could mean hours of agony, and then silence. The mother might die, the baby too, and life would simply move on, the loss swallowed by the rhythm of a hard world. Even something as ordinary as work could be lethal. Farmers might be crushed by carts or gored by animals. Craftsmen inhaled toxic dusts from wool, stone, and dyes. Miners worked in blackness, their lungs slowly drowning in soot. Soldiers marched into battle with nothing but chainmail and hope. Wounds festered. Amputations were crude. Surgeons, if they existed at all, worked with unwashed tools and zero anesthesia. Pain was not managed, it was endured. And when the body ached, when the fever raged or the belly swelled with no relief in sight, people turned to what they knew. Charms, saints, bloodletting, and leeches. Physicians, trained in the 4 humors, might balance your phlegm or drain your excess bile. There were no diagnostic tools, no microscopes, no labs-only guesses, often fatal. The wealthiest might access rare herbs or exotic remedies, But even kings could not buy immunity from disease. All of this made 30 a ripe old age. To reach 40 or 50 was almost miraculous. Most people died young and died hard. The idea of dying in your sleep was less a gentle promise and more a brutal shutdown of a body that had endured too much. The mind may have been willing, but the body gave out over and over again. And as the church bells rang once more, another soul slipped quietly into the soil, leaving behind a world that had no mercy. So as you lie there tonight, wrapped in clean sheets, under a roof untouched by plague, consider how remarkable that is. The sniffles no longer threaten your life. A fever leads to a doctor, not a funeral. And where once pain was inevitable, now it's optional. The world may be chaotic, but at least we've tamed death just a little. And that is no small miracle. In the Middle Ages, disease was a tyrant that bowed to no crown. Royalty, nobility, peasants all stood equally vulnerable before illnesses that neither gold nor lineage could command. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no Urs or Icus. The palace and the hovel were separated by walls and wealth, but death slipped through both without knocking. To be born, even into privilege, was no guarantee of survival. Kings died of infected wounds, queens of childbirth fever, princes of fevers with no names. In the great tapestry of medieval life, disease was the dark thread that wove through all. One of the most feared killers was smallpox, a scourge that painted the body in pustules and left survivors disfigured or blind. It struck indiscriminately and swiftly. In towns and cities, an outbreak could erase entire families. The sickness would begin with a fever, then a rash, then days of excruciating suffering. The luckiest either recovered with scars or died quickly. There was no vaccine, no treatment, just isolation and despair. Those who tried to care for the infected often succumbed themselves. Death was contagious, and kindness could be a sentence. Leprosy, now known as Hansen's disease, was another condition that haunted the medieval imagination. It did not kill quickly, but it isolated completely. Once diagnosed often erroneously, people were cast out, forced to live in leper colonies at the edges of society. The disease caused numbness, nerve damage, and disfigurement over many years. It also bred profound spiritual fear. Many believed it to be divine punishment, a mark of sin on the body. Leper bells warned others to stay away, and the lepers themselves sometimes walked shrouded in white like ghosts before death. Tuberculosis, known simply as consumption, was a slow, wasting killer. It stole breath, energy, and eventually life, often over months or years. Those afflicted coughed endlessly, spat blood, and withered away in front of family and friends. The romanticized image of the pale, tragic poet dying of consumption came centuries later, but in the Middle Ages, it was a relentless reality. Homes with consumptive members were often marked by sadness and helplessness. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, only the sense that something inside was quietly burning away the life. Even the humble toothache could be the start of a death sentence. Dental infections had nowhere to go except deeper into the body. An abscess might seem like a minor pain at first, but it could spread into the jaw, neck, or brain. Blood infections, now called sepsis, were a mystery. A person could be walking one day and in delirium the next, with a swollen face and a raging fever. Without surgical intervention or antibiotics, the body simply collapsed under the weight of invisible invaders. The only recourse was prayer and patience. Strep throat, today treated with a simple course of penicillin, often became scarlet fever, which could damage the heart and kidneys if it didn't kill outright. Children were especially vulnerable. Their smaller bodies and undeveloped immune systems couldn't withstand the repeated assaults of bacteria. A sore throat was not a childhood nuisance, it was a danger. Parents lived with constant dread, watching for signs of fever rash, or strange behavior. The nursery could turn into a deathbed in just a few days. Grief was a frequent guest in every home. Then, there were childhood illnesses that are nearly forgotten in the modern West: measles, mumps, and rubella. These were more than rashes and fevers in the Middle Ages. They were population-level threats. A child exposed to measles might suffer blindness, encephalitis, or death. Mumps could lead to sterility or meningitis. Rubella, when passed to pregnant women, caused miscarriages or congenital defects. There were no vaccines, of course. A single infection could sweep through a village and leave behind a generation marked by loss. Another silent killer was rheumatic fever, a complication of untreated strep infections. It often damaged the heart permanently. Medieval doctors had no concept of autoimmune reactions. A child might recover from a sore throat, only to collapse months later from heart failure. Parents who had believed the danger had passed were suddenly burying their children. Life was a cycle of fear and mourning, punctuated by rare stretches of calm. The body was always vulnerable, even after the fever broke. Even mild infections were dangerous in an era without cleanliness. A kitchen knife nicking the skin, a blister from a boot, or a thorny bramble scratch could invite gangrene. With no antiseptics, wounds festered. Flies laid eggs in open cuts. The smell of rot could be the first warning. Amputations were sometimes performed with no anesthesia, using heated blades to cauterize the stump. But the surgery itself often killed the patient through shock or blood loss. The most merciful end came from the infection running its course before the blade was ever drawn. At times, entire illnesses were blamed on supernatural causes. Epilepsy was called the falling sickness and thought to be caused by demonic possession. Fevers were attributed to sin or planetary misalignment. Instead of antibiotics, patients were given relics, exorcisms, or bled with leeches. Charms were sewn into clothing. Magical thinking filled the void where medicine should have been. Even the most educated physicians relied on astrology and humors. The sick were often punished, blamed, or exiled, adding shame to their suffering. And perhaps most sobering of all was how familiar death became. A child watching a sibling die of fever might later see the same fate befall their parents. By the time someone reached adulthood, they had attended more funerals than birthdays. Death was not a sudden event. It was a lifelong shadow. A sore throat could kill. A chill could turn into pneumonia. A fever might burn the mind into madness. In this world, health was not a right, but a fleeting privilege. And every breath carried a risk. In the Middle Ages, childbirth was a sacred act wrapped in shadow and danger. It was both a miracle and a gamble, a threshold between life and death. Women bore children at home, surrounded by midwives, sisters, and mothers, with no trained physicians, no surgical tools, and no understanding of infection. There was no anesthesia, no blood transfusions, no sterile field. Birth was a ritual passed down through generations, soaked in prayer and panic. It was as common as it was deadly. Many women gave birth not once, but 10 or 12 times in their short lives, starting in their teens. With every pregnancy came risk of miscarriage, of stillbirth, of hemorrhage, of puerperal fever, a postnatal infection caused by unclean hands or instruments. The baby's position could mean the difference between a difficult delivery and a fatal one. If the child was breech, or the mother too exhausted to push, there was no help. The only tools available were crude hooks, forceps, and knives wielded in desperation. Often, only one life could be saved. Puerperal fever was especially insidious. It could set in after a seemingly normal delivery, as bacteria entered the body through torn tissue. The mother might feel chills and weakness, followed by intense pain and high fever. Within days, she would be delirious. The infection spread fast, with no antibiotics to slow it. Entire maternity wards centuries later would learn that a simple act washing hands could save countless lives. But in the Middle Ages, the connection had not yet been made. Mothers died, and their deaths were called natural. Even when childbirth did not end in death, it often left lifelong injuries. Prolonged labor could result in fistulas, openings between the birth canal and bladder or rectum, causing incontinence and social ostracism. Pelvic organs could prolapse. Chronic pain was common, but these complications were largely endured in silence. Women were expected to bear children and accept the suffering that came with it. There was no rehabilitation, no surgical correction, just the hope of survival and the pressure to conceive again. And for those who died, death by fever was rarely peaceful. The end came through exhaustion, dehydration, or organ failure. The skin might grow blotchy, the lips blue, breathing slowed, became ragged, the body curled in on itself. In many cases, the final hours were filled with incoherent whispers, apologies, warnings, names of the dead. Those left behind spoke of souls being claimed by spirits or demons. The fever, in their eyes, was not just illness. It was a passage, a reckoning, a purging flame that revealed the soul before extinguishing it. Today, a fever often leads to a doctor's visit or a restful afternoon in bed. We swallow pills, drink clear fluids, and recover without fear. But in the Middle Ages, fever was fire, unpredictable, consuming, and often final. It reminded all who witnessed it that the body is fragile, that health is fleeting, and that death may come not with a sword or storm, but with the slow, quiet heat of the blood. And when it came, it left behind only silence and the smell of sweat-soaked sheets cooling in the dark. In the Middle Ages, to be treated for an illness was often as dangerous as the illness itself. Without the tools of modern science, no microscopes, no knowledge of bacteria or viruses, no understanding of how the body truly worked, medicine was a swirling mix of superstition, tradition, and blind experimentation. Physicians operated with the best intentions, but their methods, based on ancient texts and mystical beliefs, often caused more harm than healing. The body was a mystery, and many of its so-called cures walked hand in hand with death. At the heart of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. This ancient Greek idea, passed down from Hippocrates and Galen, dictated that illness came from an imbalance of these fluids. A fever meant too much blood, melancholy, an excess of black bile. Treatments focused not on fighting disease, but on restoring balance, often through drastic means. A patient suffering from a high fever might be bled until they fainted. Someone with a cold might be purged with vomiting herbs. Each remedy pushed the body to its limit. Bloodletting was the most common of these practices. Doctors used knives, leeches, or special lances to drain what they believed was excess blood. Sometimes they targeted specific veins tied to the affected part of the body. If a patient had a sore throat, blood might be drawn from the arm or neck. This process weakened the already sick, often to the point of collapse. In many cases, patients died not from their original illness, but from the treatment itself. Too much blood lost, too much trauma endured. And yet, the method persisted for centuries. Emetics and purgatives were equally brutal. Patients were given concoctions to force vomiting or violent diarrhea, in the belief that their illness was something to be expelled. These might include infusions of hellebore, castor oil, or even mercury substances we now know to be toxic. The results were unpredictable. A mild purge might leave someone exhausted but relieved. A stronger dose could dehydrate them fatally. It was not uncommon for patients to soil themselves uncontrollably or suffer internal bleeding. Still, if they survived, it was taken as proof that the remedy worked. Herbalism offered a gentler path, though not always a safer one. Monasteries and local healers developed vast knowledge of plants, some with genuine medicinal value. Willow bark, for instance, held the same compound as modern aspirin. Garlic fought infection. Honey soothed wounds. But for every helpful herb, there were many misused ones. Foxglove, which contains digitalis, could help the heart or stop it entirely if given in excess. Nightshade, henbane, and hemlock were all used, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. The difference between medicine and poison was a matter of dose, and dosage was guesswork. Beyond the physical treatments, there were spiritual prescriptions. Illness was often seen as divine punishment, the result of sin or a test from God. Physicians and priests alike prescribed prayer, fasting, and pilgrimage. Relics of saints were pressed to the skin. Holy water was drunk. Some patients were exorcised to expel the evil believed to be causing their suffering. In extreme cases, especially during epidemics, self-flagellation became a form of public penance. Groups of people whipped themselves through the streets, hoping their pain would appease a wrathful God and drive the sickness away. Astrology also played a major role in diagnosis and treatment. Many physicians consulted star charts before prescribing medicine or performing procedures. They believed the positions of the planets influenced the body and its humors. Certain days were deemed favorable for healing. Others were cursed. A surgeon might delay a procedure because Mars was in retrograde, or a physician might diagnose a stomach issue based on the moon's position. This blending of cosmic and corporeal forces made medicine more of an art than a science, guided by celestial guesswork. The sick were often treated in places that barely resembled our idea of a hospital. Infirmaries, usually run by monks or nuns, provided beds and basic care, but sanitation was non-existent. Patients were crowded together, their wounds exposed, their bodies unwashed. Cross-infection was rampant. One patient's fever could spread to a dozen others. Surgical tools were reused without cleaning. Bandages were made from linen strips that had already wrapped other wounds. Even the water used for bathing or cleaning was often shared between patients. Surgery, though rare, was a nightmare of pain and risk. Without anesthesia, procedures were performed on conscious patients held down by assistants. There was no understanding of antisepsis, no sterilization, no gloves, no masks. A surgeon might cut into a leg with a blood-crusted blade, then move on to lance a boil with the same tool. Infection almost always followed. Amputations were especially grisly. If the bleeding didn't kill the patient, the gangrene that followed likely would. Surgeons were often seen as butchers, feared more than revered. The wealthy sometimes fared worse. Their physicians had access to the most exotic and most dangerous remedies. Gold dust, powdered pearls, ground mummies imported from Egypt, and even unicorn horn were sold as miracle cures. These were not only ineffective, but often toxic. Yet because they were expensive and rare, they were seen as potent. Royals and nobles swallowed poisons in search of healing, their status buying them not safety, but elaborate suffering. Looking back, it's easy to marvel at how far we've come. Today's treatments are backed by clinical trials, molecular science, and sterile environments. But it's also humbling to remember how recent that revolution is. For most of history, to seek medical help was to take a gamble. The healer's hand might save or seal your fate. The pills we swallow so casually today were once fantasies. And in the flickering candlelit rooms of the Middle Ages, surrounded by chants and strange tinctures, people clung to life the only way they knew, by enduring the cure as bravely as the disease. The most infamous killer of the Middle Ages wasn't a knight or a king, it was a microbe. The Black Death, as it came to be known, descended upon Europe in the mid-14th century like a dark cloud, transforming the continent in ways that no war or ruler ever had. Carried by fleas on rats and spreading with relentless speed, the plague didn't just kill, it unraveled the very fabric of society. Entire cities emptied, economies collapsed, and faith in medicine, government, and even God was shaken to the core. No one understood what it was, but everyone feared it, and for good reason. It began, they say, in Asia, moving westward along trade routes. By the time it reached Europe in 1347, it had already carved a trail of devastation. Ships arriving in ports like Genoa or Marseille carried more than spices and silk. They carried death. Sailors, pale and feverish, with boils the size of eggs under their arms and between their legs, died within days of arrival. The disease spread not by touch alone, but through the very air people breathed. In a world without knowledge of bacteria, the idea of invisible contagion felt like sorcery. Panic ignited like wildfire. Bubonic plague was the most common form, marked by grotesque swellings buboes. It turned black and ruptured painfully. Victims also experienced fevers, vomiting, and delirium. In some cases, the infection reached the lungs, becoming pneumonic plague, which spread through coughing and sneezing. This form was even deadlier, killing within hours. Then there was the septicemic plague, rarer still, which infected the blood and caused sudden death without warning. With no treatments, no understanding, and no way to stop the spread, entire communities vanished seemingly overnight. The death toll was staggering. It's estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population perished in just a few short years. In cities, corpses piled in the streets. Graveyards overflowed. In some regions, there were too few living to bury the dead. Monks, priests, and physicians died alongside peasants and nobles. The pestilence recognized no class or creed. Families abandoned their sick, entire villages sealed themselves off, and some towns enacted desperate quarantines, often too late. Fear transformed neighbors into strangers and strangers into threats. Responses to the plague varied wildly, and few were effective. Some towns blamed outsiders Jews, lepers, foreigners, leading to brutal persecutions and massacres. Others turned inward, seeking forgiveness from heaven. Flagellants, groups of religious zealots, roamed from town to town, whipping themselves in hopes of appeasing God's wrath. They believed the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. Churches filled with desperate prayers. Altars overflowed with offerings. Yet the death continued, silent and unstoppable, paying no heed to pleas or penance. Doctors, helpless in the face of the plague, turned to ritual and superstition. They wore long robes and the now iconic beaked masks filled with herbs and perfumes meant to protect them from miasma or bad air. They carried canes to examine patients without touching them. Treatments ranged from bloodletting and lancing buboes to burning aromatic herbs and fumigating homes. Few of these measures worked. Most doctors who treated the plague eventually died from it. The mask became not a symbol of healing, but of hopelessness. The social consequences were just as profound as the medical. With so many dead, the labor force collapsed. Fields lay fallow. Markets closed. Inheritance disputes surged as families vanished. The scarcity of workers allowed surviving peasants to demand better wages and conditions, contributing to the slow erosion of the feudal system. Religious faith also faltered. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why did the church's prayers fail? Some turned to mysticism, others to nihilism. Art and literature darkened, filled with skeletal imagery, dancing corpses, and a fascination with death. The plague returned in waves for centuries, never again as deadly as in the 14th century, but always feared. Each recurrence reminded people of the fragility of life and the impotence of medicine. Communities developed plague protocols isolation, burning infected belongings, fleeing cities. But without scientific knowledge, every response was reactive. Hope rested not on cures, but on survival. People lived in a state of anxious watchfulness, waiting for the first sign of swelling, the first cough, the first death. And when it came, there was little to be done. In hindsight, the Black Death was not just a biological event, it was a turning point. It exposed the limits of medieval knowledge. It forced societies to rethink labor, faith, medicine, and mortality. It planted seeds that would one day grow into scientific inquiry and public health. But at the time, it was nothing but horror, a silent, black tide that swept away mothers, fathers, children, and cities. And the memory of it lingered, whispered from generation to generation, a warning wrapped in fear. Today, we look back at the plague with the clarity of hindsight. We know it was caused by Yersinia pestis, a bacterium treatable with antibiotics. We understand how it spread, how it might have been slowed. But we also understand how terrifying it must have been to face death without explanation, to bury your family with no idea why they died. The Black Death reminds us that modern medicine is not just a convenience. It is a miracle built on the bones of the past. And in the silence of the medieval streets once filled with cries and coughs, we can still hear the echoes of a world undone. The fate of the child was equally precarious. Newborns were especially vulnerable in their first weeks. Without formula or sterilized bottles, infants depended entirely on breast milk. If the mother died, a wet nurse was needed. If one could not be found, the child often followed its mother to the grave. Weaning was perilous too. Contaminated food, unboiled water, or spoiled milk could sicken a baby beyond saving. Infant mortality was so expected that some babies were not even named until weeks after birth. Superstition surrounded the birth process. Amulets were hung over the bed, prayers whispered at every contraction. Saints were invoked, especially Saint Margaret, patroness of childbirth. Some believed that demons could enter a woman's body during labor, or that evil spirits lingered near birthing rooms. To ward them off, crosses were drawn on doorways, iron placed under the bed, or salt sprinkled in corners. These rites were not mere folk tales. They were acts of protection in a world where medicine offered little. Midwives held crucial power in this space. They guided labor, delivered babies, and tended to the mother afterward. Some were deeply knowledgeable, with generations of experience. But they also lived in a precarious social position, respected, feared, and sometimes accused of witchcraft when births went wrong. If a child was stillborn or deformed, suspicion could fall on the woman who delivered it. Midwives were often scapegoats, their skills interpreted as dark magic rather than hard-earned wisdom. For noble women, childbirth was no safer. Though they might have access to better nutrition or herbal remedies, they still lacked the protection of sterile environments or trained doctors. Queens died in childbirth with alarming regularity. The death of a noble woman could disrupt alliances, trigger disputes over succession, or plunge kingdoms into crisis. Yet even at the highest ranks, women were not shielded from the basic risks of the body. Blood did not recognize titles. Infection did not favor peasants. Men, too, were often powerless in these moments. Husbands waited outside the birthing room, listening for cries or silence. They might pace in prayer or freeze in fear, but few entered the sacred, volatile space of birth. When things went wrong, they called the priest. And if both mother and child died, they dug graves. There was no intervention, no emergency response. The outcome was accepted as fate, a test of faith, or punishment for sin. Today, the idea of death in childbirth feels distant. Hospitals hum with monitors. Pain relief is expected, and trained staff are always near. But for most of human history, childbirth was a battlefield. Every contraction was a step closer to life, or the end of it. Women gave everything, often without thanks, sometimes without remembrance. And in the quiet of their rooms, surrounded by candlelight and whispers, they faced the raw edge of mortality, again and again. In our modern world, a scraped knee is little more than an annoyance. A dab of antiseptic, a sterile bandage, and a few days of healing, nothing more. But in the Middle Ages, such a wound could set in motion a quiet march toward death. The concept of antisepsis was unknown. Bacteria, as a word or an idea did not exist. A seemingly innocent cut could fester into something monstrous. This chapter explores the lurking dangers of wounds, infections, and the invisible armies that claimed lives with no warning and no mercy. Imagine a farmer slicing his palm while sharpening a scythe. He might wrap it in a soiled rag, grit his teeth, and continue working. The wound might sting for a few days, then swell. Redness would spread. Soon his arm would grow hot and tender, his skin tight and shiny. Fever would follow. The man would shake and sweat in the night, muttering in delirium. Within a week, his body might be overtaken by sepsis, though no one knew the word. They would say he'd caught a bad wind or was cursed by foul humors. Death came silently, without fanfare, as the infection poisoned his blood. Gangrene was another common killer. Without circulation, tissue dies. In the medieval world, injuries often became necrotic. Skin blackened, limbs swelled, and the smell putrid, an unmistakable signal that flesh was rotting. Flies laid eggs in the wounds. Maggots hatched and fed. Some healers, unknowingly, used these maggots to clean wounds, and modern science has since confirmed their usefulness. But in most cases, there was no care at all. Amputation was the only hope, performed with crude blades, without anesthetic. Most did not survive the operation, either from shock or subsequent infection. Soldiers were especially vulnerable. Medieval battles were not clean affairs. Weapons were jagged and brutal swords, axes, maces, designed to maim as much as kill. A puncture from a rusty arrowhead or a slash from a dirty blade could leave a man writhing in the mud, his wounds caked with earth and manure. If he lived through the fight, he still had to face the long days of festering injuries. Without antibiotics, battlefield medicine was a grim business of crude bandages, prayers, and watching comrades slowly waste away from wounds that should have been survivable. In urban centers, artisans and laborers faced daily risks. A cobbler might jab himself with an awl. A blacksmith might burn his skin. A stonemason might chip a splinter into his leg. These small accidents were common, and they came with disproportionate consequences. Inflammation might begin slowly, but without knowledge of proper wound care, infections flourished. Cuts reopened, pus drained endlessly, limbs stiffened, and when tetanus set in, the victim suffered convulsions, muscle spasms, and eventual suffocation. It was a horrifying way to die, and completely untreatable at the time. There were herbal remedies, of course. Healers used honey for its antibacterial properties, though few understood why it worked. Poultices were made from garlic, onion, and various roots. Some were genuinely helpful. Others introduced more contamination. Wounds were packed with dirt, dung, or vinegar. The intention was to draw out infection or balance humors, but the result often accelerated decay. Superstition mixed with observation in unpredictable ways. A wound might be prayed over, or cursed by rivals, or left to the will of God. Medical logic was as mystical as it was practical. Children, full of energy and constantly scraping themselves, were especially at risk. Playing in the alleys, climbing trees, helping with chores, they acquired cuts and bruises daily. A child's skinned elbow could spiral into a limb-threatening infection. Parents, already burdened by the threats of disease and hunger, watched with silent dread when a child limped or winced. If swelling followed, or the child developed a fever, hope dwindled. Parents would turn to midwives, charm readers, herbalists, anyone who might offer relief. But often, all they could do was wait. Even routine practices like bloodletting opened doors to infection. Veins were cut intentionally to balance the humors, often by barbers or monks. The blades used were rarely cleaned. Bandages were reused. The same tools that sliced into one patient might slice into another moments later. Infection spread rapidly in this way. What began as a therapeutic incision could become an infected sore. Ironically, a procedure meant to restore health often hastened death. And yet, it persisted for centuries, unquestioned. The lack of sanitation compounded every risk. Flies swarmed open wounds. Chamber pots were emptied in the streets. Water for cleaning was drawn from the same source as waste disposal. Even if a wound was tended, it was nearly impossible to keep it clean. The environment was hostile to healing. Skin did not close, it oozed. Tissue broke down. Fevers rose. Death crept in under the guise of a little scratch. And all the while, no one could name the culprit. No one could see the war raging beneath the skin. To the medieval mind, death from a wound was not absurd, it was expected. People whispered that the devil entered through open flesh, or that the soul escaped before the body was ready. A fatal cut was a reminder of human frailty, of the thin line between life and death. No one was safe from the slow death of infection. Not peasants, not knights, not kings. The body was a fragile shell, and even the smallest breach could open it to ruin. And so people feared sharp things not just for their pain, but for their prophecy. Today, we shrug off paper cuts and carry on with our day. We clean wounds with alcohol wipes, seal them with sterile gauze, and never give them a second thought. But this ease, this safety, is new. It is a luxury bought by centuries of suffering, by lives lost to splinters and scratches. In the medieval world, wounds were not inconveniences, they were omens. And the miracle of healing was not common, but a quiet defiance of fate. To fall ill with a fever in the Middle Ages was to stand at the edge of the unknown. Heat rose in the body, the mind drifted into delirium, and those who watched could do little but pray. Fevers were not seen as symptoms of underlying disease, but as diseases themselves, mysterious visitors that consumed the body from within. In a world without thermometers or antibiotics, the body's rising heat was a terrifying transformation, one that could end in recovery or in death, and there was no telling which outcome awaited. Fever could come from almost anything, an infected wound, a bad bite of food, even the changing of the seasons. The line between food poisoning and deadly illness was razor thin. People might eat meat that had been smoked but not preserved, or drink milk gone sour from poor storage. Within hours, the shivering would begin. Skin would grow pale, then flush. The heartbeat would quicken. And then, in the long hours of night, the fever would set in fully stealing sleep, soaking sheets and twisting the mind into hallucination. The most dreaded fevers were those without clear cause. Physicians and monks spoke of tertian or quartan fevers, names drawn from the days on which the chills returned. These were often forms of malaria, especially in warmer, marshy regions. The afflicted would swing violently between hot and cold, lucid and lost. Without quinine or any effective remedy, the disease could linger for weeks, sap strength, and return again with a vengeance. Many wasted away over months, never truly recovering, their bodies racked by cyclical suffering. Then there were the sudden fevers, the kind that struck with no warning and ended in death within days. Meningitis, influenza, or bacterial pneumonia could move through towns like wildfire. One day a person might be working in the fields or baking bread, and the next they'd be writhing in bed, their mind burning with visions, their breath short and wet. These illnesses often appeared during colder months when people huddled indoors, sharing warmth and germs. There were no vaccines, no quarantines, no emergency care, just the rise and fall of human breath in dark rooms. Children were especially vulnerable. A baby who seemed well at sunrise might be burning with fever by sunset. Parents had no thermometers, only the touch of the forehead, the look in the child's eyes, the arch of their back. If the child stopped eating or moaned in sleep, dread set in. Mothers whispered prayers. Fathers rode to nearby villages for herbalists. But more often than not, they simply sat and watched, helpless as the fever stole their child's light. Even those who survived often emerged changed, weak, stunted, or with seizures that would mark them for life. For adults, the worst fevers brought madness. In the grips of high heat, the mind unraveled. People muttered in tongues, screamed in terror, or laughed without meaning. Some thrashed violently, needing to be tied to beds. Others saw visions, angels, or demons, lost loved ones, fields afire. In many towns, this was not seen as illness, but as possession. Priests were summoned. Exorcisms were performed. The fevered were made to drink holy water, wear relics, or confess to sins they didn't commit, all while their bodies fought for life on their own terms. Water was a double-edged sword. Some healers believed in soaking the fevered body to draw out the heat. Others feared water entirely, thinking it opened the pores to bad humors or malevolent spirits. Cold compresses were rare, and baths even rarer. Instead, patients were bundled in furs or layers of wool, left to sweat it out. Rooms became ovens of moisture and dread. Ventilation was unheard of. Air grew stale. And as fevers peaked, so too did the stench of human suffering. The body burned, and often it burned alone. Recovery, if it came, was seen as divine intervention. The fever would break suddenly, quietly. The patient would sleep deeply for the first time in days. Upon waking, they would be drenched in sweat, weak as a child, but alive. Families rejoiced. Offerings were made to saints. Thankfulness rang through chapels. But the scars remained. The fevered often lost weight, hair, or even memory. Some never walked again. Others slipped into melancholy or silence. Survival did not mean wholeness. It meant endurance. In the medieval world, hunger was more than a discomfort. It was a relentless predator. It stalked the peasant and the noble alike, though it fed more often on the poor. Unlike the sudden shock of disease, famine was a slow, creeping force. It hollowed out bodies and drained spirits, often without drama or spectacle. There were no pills, no food banks, no safety nets. When the crops failed or the stores ran dry, people died not quickly, but by degrees. Malnutrition was not a tragedy, it was a fact of life, a cruel daily companion for millions. The medieval diet was heavily dependent on bread and grain, especially for the poor. Barley, rye, and oats formed the foundation of most meals, supplemented by vegetables and, on rare occasions, bits of cheese, fish, or meat. But these staples were vulnerable. A late frost, too much rain, or an outbreak of crop disease could decimate harvests. Without refrigeration or modern storage methods, surplus food couldn't be kept from year to year. One bad season meant months of empty stomachs. 2 in a row could empty entire villages. The most infamous example was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. For nearly 3 years, Europe suffered relentless rains that drowned crops and rotted stored grain. Livestock starved or succumbed to disease. Bread prices soared, and people began to eat anything they could find: grass, bark, roots. There are accounts of people digging up freshly buried bodies for meat, or murdering travelers for food. Children were abandoned or sold. The church prayed, and the people despaired. By the time the skies cleared, millions had died, not by violence, but by hunger's quiet hand. Even in better years, malnutrition haunted daily life. A peasant might fill his belly with black bread and thin stew, but the nutritional content was desperately lacking. Deficiencies in vitamins and minerals led to diseases like rickets, which bowed children's legs, scurvy, which rotted gums and weakened the body, and pellagra, which caused skin lesions and madness. These conditions weren't recognized as diseases. They were simply part of the human condition, attributed to bad luck, divine punishment, or one's social lot. Children bore the brunt of these shortages. Malnourished from birth, many never reached their full height or strength. Their immune systems, weakened by constant deprivation, left them vulnerable to every passing illness. A minor cold could spiral into pneumonia. A mild infection could become fatal. Bones grew brittle, minds fogged. The body conserved what little energy it had, sacrificing growth and vitality to simply survive another day. In communities where half of all children died before the age of 5, food was both a necessity and a cruel lottery. For pregnant women, malnutrition carried additional risks. Without sufficient nutrients, pregnancy became an ordeal. Babies were born underweight or stillborn. Mothers hemorrhaged during delivery or succumbed to infection afterward. Even a small deficiency in iron or calcium could tilt the balance toward death. There were no prenatal vitamins, no knowledge of folic acid or balanced diets. Expectant mothers ate what was available, sometimes little more than hard bread and weak broth. The body gave what it could. Sometimes it gave too much. Famine didn't just kill the body, it distorted society. The desperation of the hungry led to theft, violence, and suspicion. Grain merchants were accused of hoarding. Bakers were attacked for raising prices. Rumors spread that the rich poisoned wells or hid stores of meat. Social cohesion broke down. People turned inward or against each other. Trust eroded. In times of plenty, a village might share its bounty. In times of famine, survival became solitary, and the hungry learned not to ask, but to take. Spiritual explanations abounded. Famines were seen as punishments from God, sent to correct the sins of the people. Priests called for fasts and prayers, but for those already starving, the suggestion was bitter irony. Processions wound through cities, pleading for divine mercy. Sometimes scapegoats were found witches, heretics, foreigners blamed for cursing the land. People sought patterns in the chaos, desperate for meaning in their suffering. But no amount of penance brought back the sun or dried the fields. The heavens remained silent. When the rain stopped or the harvest finally came, the survivors emerged gaunt and changed. Many had lost family, neighbors, entire generations. The weak had perished. The strong had endured, though not without cost. Recovery was slow. Muscles needed rebuilding. Soil needed turning. Life resumed, but under the shadow of memory. Famine left scars, not just on bodies, but on minds. It taught a grim lesson, that civilization stood on the edge of a knife, and that even the simplest of needs, bread, water, warmth, could vanish in a moment. Today, we eat strawberries in winter and bread that lasts for weeks. We count calories instead of hoarding them. But it wasn't always so. Not long ago, food was uncertain. The pantry was a place of prayer. And hunger was not an appetite. It was a sentence. The modern grocery store is a monument to what we've overcome, a quiet miracle we often ignore. In the Middle Ages, hunger ruled. And when it whispered, people listened with hollow eyes, empty hands, and hearts too tired to hope. In the modern world, the idea of dying while going about your everyday routine seems remote, even absurd. We trust in regulations, safety measures, and emergency services. But in the Middle Ages, the most mundane aspects of life could prove lethal. Death lurked in tools, food, animals, weather, even sleep. There were no safety nets, no guarantees, and rarely any second chances. The same acts that sustained daily life, working, walking, eating could, without warning, turn fatal. Life was not just hard. It was hazardous by design. Start with the home itself. Medieval houses, especially those of peasants, were small, dark, and often constructed from wood, wattle, and daub. Open hearths sat in the middle of the floor, their flames uncontained by chimneys. Smoke filled the air, blackening walls and lungs. Fire was a constant threat. A spark might catch a thatched roof and consume an entire dwelling in minutes. Children could fall into the flames while playing. Adults might be burned while cooking or stoking coals. There were no fire brigades. Once it started, you either got out or you didn't. The tools of daily labor were equally dangerous. Farming implements, scythes, plows, axes were heavy, sharp, and used without modern protections. A slip while chopping wood could sever fingers or worse. A horse's kick could crush a skull. Even the simple act of grinding grain could cause injuries. Millstones were massive and unforgiving. Miller's lung, caused by breathing in fine flour dust, could develop slowly, choking the lungs with each breath. There were no protective masks, no gloves, and no workers' compensation. Just risk, accepted as part of survival. Transportation, too, was fraught with danger. Most travel was done on foot or horseback. Roads were unpaved, uneven, and often riddled with mud, ice, or animal droppings. Travelers might slip and fall, breaking bones with no access to effective medical care. A twisted ankle could mean permanent lameness. River crossings, done by rudimentary ferries or footbridges, claimed countless lives, people, and animals swept away by strong currents. If you were lucky, someone might pull you from the water. If not, your body was found days later, or not at all. Animals that today seem domesticated posed real threats. Pigs, left to scavenge freely, could become aggressive and were known to attack children. Horses and oxen, essential for transport and farming, could injure or kill with a single movement. Dogs roamed in packs in some towns, scavenging scraps and spreading disease. And then there were the truly wild animals, wolves, bears, or boars, that sometimes ventured into villages during harsh winters. The line between civilization and wilderness was thin, and nature was not tamed. Food itself was a gamble. Without refrigeration or food safety standards, spoilage was constant. People learned to eat cheese that was well past what we'd call expiration, and meats that were only semi-preserved with salt or smoke. Rye bread, if stored poorly, could grow ergot, a toxic fungus that caused convulsions, hallucinations, and gangrene. Mushrooms, wild berries, or roots picked in the forest might be nourishing or fatal. There was no labeling, no list of ingredients, only trial, error, and memory. Many families learned what not to eat by watching others suffer first. Even water was not reliably safe. Wells could be contaminated by nearby latrines. Streams ran through pastures and absorbed animal waste. Boiling water was not yet common practice. People who drank freely from natural sources often developed intestinal diseases, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid. These were not traumatic killers, but slow ones. They weakened the body, dehydrated the system, and left people vulnerable to everything else. A glass of water, so basic and essential, could begin the slow descent toward death. Weather played its own deadly role. There were no forecasts, no early warnings. A sudden thunderstorm might flood a town, destroying crops and drowning livestock. Lightning strikes were feared as signs of divine displeasure, but they also caused fires and deaths. Harsh winters froze the elderly and the weak. People died in their sleep beneath thin blankets. In summer, heat stroke and dehydration claimed others. The changing of seasons was not a time for poetry. It was a test of endurance, and each year had its casualties. Sleep, which we now associate with safety and recovery, was not always peaceful. In homes filled with smoke, people developed respiratory illnesses that worsened overnight. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs infested straw mattresses, spreading disease. Rodents scurried across floors, gnawed at food stores, and sometimes bit the sleeping. A poorly constructed loft might collapse. A drunken neighbor might knock over a candle. In towns, night watchmen were rare, and crime flourished after dark. To close your eyes was to take a risk. You might not wake up, and if you did, you might not be whole. In all this, there was little recourse. There were no insurance claims, no hospitals to patch you up, no legal protections. The world was indifferent to your misstep, and death did not discriminate between the careless and the cautious. Life required a constant awareness, a quiet vigilance. Every action carried risk, and every breath might be your last, yet people persisted. They cooked, they built, they traveled. They loved knowing that any part of their daily routine could be the end. It is a sobering reminder that what we call ordinary was once extraordinary and often deadly. To be a child in the Middle Ages was to live with one foot in the grave. While today's children grow up surrounded by vaccinations, routine checkups, and emergency care, medieval children were born into a world where survival itself was a daily achievement. There were no pediatricians, no understanding of childhood development, and no specialized treatments for young bodies. From the moment they took their first breath, children faced a gauntlet of disease, injury, hunger, and neglect. Many never made it out of infancy. Those who did bore scars on their bodies, minds, and hearts. The earliest days of life were the most perilous. Without sterilization or prenatal care, births were fraught with risk for both mother and child. Midwives did what they could, but complications like breech births, tangled cords, and fevers after delivery often proved fatal. Newborns who survived birth might be too weak to nurse, too small to regulate their temperature, or vulnerable to infection from unsanitary surroundings. Premature infants rarely survived, and there were no incubators or feeding tubes to aid them. Many babies died nameless, buried quietly in small shrouds or unmarked graves. Even healthy newborns faced constant threats. Infant mortality rates were staggering, with estimates suggesting that up to half of all children died before their 5th birthday. Common killers included diarrhea, respiratory infections, and fevers of unknown origin. Coughs could become fatal. A rash could signal something far worse. Parents watched helplessly as babies cried through the night, burned with fever, or grew listless and pale. With no knowledge of germs or viruses, remedies were limited to prayers, herbs, and desperate hope. Sometimes, even the comfort of breastfeeding failed to protect them. Childhood illnesses like measles, mumps, and whooping cough were not rites of passage. They were battles for survival. A child with a high fever might develop seizures. Others lost their hearing or eyesight as a result of infections. Severe malnutrition was also widespread. Families too poor to provide adequate food watched their children grow thin and frail, their bellies distended, their hair brittle. Without essential vitamins and minerals, young bodies could not develop properly. Bones softened, teeth decayed, and immune systems collapsed. Disease did not need to be powerful to be deadly, just persistent. In some regions, wet nurses were employed to feed the children of the wealthy, particularly if the mother had died or was otherwise unable to nurse. While some wet nurses were experienced and careful, others took on too many infants at once, compromising the quality of care. Poor sanitation, lack of clean water, and crowded conditions often led to outbreaks of disease in these informal nurseries. Meanwhile, orphaned or abandoned children were sometimes left at monasteries or convents, where they might receive basic care, but rarely love or attention. Institutional survival was not the same as a childhood. Even play came with its risks. Without supervision or safety measures, children explored forests, climbed unstable structures, and played near wells, fire pits, or animals. A simple fall could break a bone that never healed correctly. A misstep near a river could end in drowning. Tools were left within reach. Animals weren't always friendly. And if a child grew ill or injured, the family's limited resources meant that care was often delayed or not given at all. A broken leg could become infected. A cough could signal pneumonia. Children were expected to be hardy, or they were not expected to live. Education was a rare privilege. Most children of peasants worked alongside their parents from the moment they could walk and follow instructions. They helped in the fields, fetched water, collected firewood, or tended animals. Exposure to the elements, long hours of labor, and poor diets all took a toll. Those lucky enough to attend church schools or monasteries received instruction in Latin and Scripture, but few beyond the nobility were afforded this chance. Learning was a luxury, and most children grew up illiterate, focused not on dreams, but on duties. Grief was a constant in the lives of medieval families. Parents buried multiple children. Siblings disappeared from the household, replaced by silence and sorrow. In some communities, it was customary to delay naming a child until they survived the first few weeks. Baptism was rushed, often performed within hours of birth, in case the baby died soon after. Death was so common that mourning was often compressed. There was work to do, more mouths to feed, and other children to protect. Yet that did not mean the losses didn't ache. They were simply folded into life's rhythm. Some tried to shield their children with superstition. Charms were sewn into clothing. Tiny relics were worn around necks. Children were kept indoors during certain lunar phases or during unlucky days. Prayers were said to ward off evil spirits. The evil eye was blamed for sudden illnesses or misfortunes. Though none of these rituals could truly protect a child from disease or injury, they offered a sliver of comfort to families who had no other recourse. In the absence of science, belief became a kind of shield. Today, we count on vaccines, pediatric care, and nutrition to ensure children survive and thrive. We child-proof our homes, monitor growth charts, and rush to clinics at the first sign of illness. But in the Middle Ages, childhood was a crucible. It tested every body born into the world. Many were lost. Those who lived carried memories of siblings who didn't. They bore the weight of survival from their earliest years. And while modern children are protected by layers of knowledge and infrastructure, the children of the medieval world were protected only by chance and by the fragile will to keep breathing, one day at a time. Mental illness in the Middle Ages was a terrifying enigma, feared, misunderstood, and often punished. While the body's wounds were visible and sometimes treatable, afflictions of the mind were invisible specters. There were no psychiatrists, no diagnosis, no language to describe depression, anxiety, or psychosis. What we now understand as disorders of the brain and nervous system were then seen through the lens of sin, possession, or divine punishment. The mind, like the soul, was thought to be susceptible to corruption, and when it unraveled, the consequences were often grim. A person showing signs of madness might begin with strange behavior, talking to themselves, refusing food, withdrawing from others, or acting erratically. Without understanding of neurological or psychological disorders, such symptoms were feared and stigmatized. Families might hide afflicted members, or turn to the church for help. A melancholic man who sat weeping for hours was thought to suffer from an imbalance of black bile. A woman who hallucinated or screamed during fits might be said to harbor a demon. And all too often, such people were left to suffer in silence or in chains. Depression, though unnamed, was widespread, especially among those who endured famine, war, and repeated loss. Life in the Middle Ages was emotionally brutal. People buried children, starved through winters, and faced violence without warning. Those who broke under the weight of these burdens were not treated, they were shamed or ignored. Sadness that lingered was seen as weakness, or worse, a spiritual failing. The deeply despondent were urged to confess, to pray harder, or to purge their sins. Few saw their condition as a sickness. Most saw it as a moral lapse. In cases of psychosis or schizophrenia, the situation could be far more dire. Voices, delusions, or sudden rages were terrifying, not just for the sufferer, but for their entire community. Without medical explanations, these episodes were almost always interpreted as signs of possession or witchcraft. Exorcisms were common. The afflicted might be tied to beds, whipped, or starved in the hope of driving the evil out. Some were imprisoned in monasteries or sent to wander alone, feared as cursed. The line between mental illness and the supernatural was blurred and often fatal. Epilepsy was particularly misunderstood. Known as the falling sickness, it struck without warning, its seizures sudden and violent. To witnesses, it seemed as if the person were seized by spirits. Those with epilepsy were sometimes banned from churches, marriages, or public life. Many were shunned entirely. Treatments ranged from prayer to ingestion of sacred relics or herbal brews. There was no recognition of the neurological origin. And if the seizures continued, the sufferer was seen as marked by darkness unfit for work, community, or dignity. Women bore an especially heavy burden. Conditions like postpartum depression, hysteria, or anxiety were often viewed as evidence of female instability or moral weakness. The womb was thought to wander within the body, causing madness, hence the word hysteria, derived from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus. Women who wept too often, who resisted marriage, who spoke of strange dreams or fears, were at risk. Some were labeled witches. Others were confined. Very few were helped. Their pain was dismissed, their insight feared, and their voices silenced. There were, however, early forms of asylum, though these were more places of isolation than care. Institutions like the Hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem in London housed the mentally ill, but conditions were harsh. Patients were chained, beaten, or displayed to the public as curiosities. There was no therapy, no attempt at healing, only control. Such places were both feared and pitied, seen as holding cells for souls beyond salvation. In many towns, there was no institution at all. The mad were left to wander, beg, or die. Some turned to folk remedies or wise women for comfort. Herbal concoctions, calming teas, and sleep-inducing tinctures were passed down through generations. Valerian, poppy, and lavender were known to ease restlessness. Mandrake and belladonna were used in small, dangerous doses. These methods sometimes helped, but more often they were inconsistent and risky. Dosages were guessed, side effects were misunderstood, and if they failed, the blame fell not on the medicine, but on the patient's soul or the supposed witch administering the cure. Art and literature of the time reveal a deep anxiety about the mind. Medieval texts describe people tormented by internal voices, demonic dreams, or sudden flights of fear. Pilgrimages were taken not just for physical healing, but for peace of mind. Saints like Dymphna and Romanus were invoked for the mentally ill. But these spiritual approaches, while comforting, rarely addressed the root causes. Instead, they provided ritual and community, a framework for suffering that, though well-meaning, offered little real relief. Suicide, when it occurred, was deeply taboo. It was seen as both a mortal sin and a crime. Those who took their own lives were denied Christian burials. Their property might be seized by the crown. Families bore shame for generations. Yet suicides happened, quietly and in secret, driven by despair, illness, or unbearable pain. The absence of understanding meant the suffering behind such acts was never properly acknowledged. The mentally ill died not just from their conditions, but from society's refusal to see them as treatable, as human, as worthy of care. In our time, we recognize mental illness as complex and treatable. We offer therapy, medication, and support. But this understanding is new and hard-won. In the Middle Ages, the mind was a battleground of spirits and shadows, its suffering hidden in silence, cloaked in shame. And yet even then, people longed for peace, for clarity, for comfort. They prayed, they wept, they endured. And in those quiet acts, even without understanding, they reached for what we all seek in the darkest moments, the hope that the storm within might someday pass. In a time when disease ran rampant and true medical knowledge was scarce, those who offered healing were often both sought after and feared. Midwives, herbalists, and so-called wise women provided essential care in countless villages. offering treatments drawn from nature and tradition, but without formal credentials, because such institutions rarely existed for women, and with their work rooted in oral knowledge, these healers existed in a precarious place. They lived on the edge of trust and suspicion, and all too often, when healing failed or even succeeded too well, it was labeled witchcraft. The Church, increasingly powerful during the medieval period, kept a wary eye on medicine that lay outside its doctrine. It tolerated basic herbal remedies, especially those used in monasteries and recorded in religious texts, but distrusted knowledge that came from unregulated, often female sources. Women who healed through herbs or incantations, who delivered babies without priestly blessings, or who claimed knowledge passed down through generations, were seen not just as independent, but as dangerous. In a deeply patriarchal society, women who wielded knowledge without male oversight were suspect. Midwives were especially vulnerable. Their role placed them at the most intimate and high-stakes moment of a woman's life: childbirth. When a baby was stillborn or a mother died in labor, a tragically common occurrence, grief often turned to blame. If the midwife had performed rituals unfamiliar to the local priest, or used herbs deemed unholy, she might be accused of harming the child or mother through sorcery. Even if she had done everything right, the sheer visibility of her role made her an easy target. To lose a child was agony. To punish someone for it, a terrible comfort. Herbalists, too, walked a dangerous line. The plants they used could ease pain, lower fevers, or soothe the stomach, but they could also, in the wrong dose, kill. Their knowledge of such things was seen as unnatural, especially when healing defied the expectations of prayer alone. If a remedy succeeded where a priest's blessing had failed, whispers might begin. How had this woman saved the dying child? Why had she known to give poppy seeds for sleep or willow bark for pain? What spirits did she consort with to gain such power? By the 15th century, as the witch craze gained momentum in Europe, thousands of women, many of them traditional healers, found themselves accused of consorting with the devil. The Malleus Maleficarum, a witch-hunting manual published in 1487, singled out midwives for suspicion. It claimed that they murdered infants, stole them for rituals, and caused miscarriages through spells. In this twisted logic, the very people who had long helped women give birth were rebranded as murderers. Their tools, herbs, oils, even birthing stools were seen not as instruments of care, but of malice. These accusations often relied on flimsy or fabricated evidence: a neighbor's complaint, a failed treatment, an old grudge. A woman who lived alone, had no husband or children, or kept a garden with strange plants could be labeled a witch. If she survived one child while another died, it was suspicious. If she healed too many people or too few, was damning. The trials were often a spectacle. Under torture, many women confessed to crimes they had never committed, simply to end the pain. And once accused, few ever walked free again. This persecution decimated communities' trust in local healers. People began to fear the very figures they had once turned to for help. Families hesitated to call the midwife. Women hid their herbal knowledge. Generations of wisdom painstakingly gathered and passed down were silenced by fire, rope, and fear. In many regions, the art of folk healing withered. Knowledge of fertility, pregnancy, pain relief, and herbal care vanished, taking with it untold potential lives saved. All because that wisdom was seen as female, foreign, and frightening. The irony was brutal. While male physicians bled patients and relied on outdated theories, many female healers were offering treatments based on observation and experience. Their methods, though imprecise, were often more effective than the sanctioned practices of licensed professionals. Yet because they lacked academic standing, because they operated outside the walls of the university and the church, their work was not only dismissed, but demonized. Healing, when done by the wrong hands, was no longer a gift. It was a threat. Even those spared the stake suffered. A healer might be driven from her village, her home burned, her children taken. She might live out her days in hiding, afraid to share the very skills that had once sustained her community. Some women simply stopped practicing, fearing accusation. Others turned their knowledge into whispers, sharing it only with the most trusted allies. Healing, once an open act of communal care, became a shadowed secret. The cost of saving a life could be losing your own. Today, we honor doctors, midwives, and herbalists as valuable members of society. We recognize the legitimacy of multiple paths to healing. But it took centuries to unlearn the fear that once surrounded women's knowledge of the body and nature. The persecution of healers in the Middle Ages was not just a tragedy of individuals. It was a collective loss of wisdom, compassion, and possibility. And beneath the ashes of those burnings, beneath the silence that followed, lies a truth we must never forget. Sometimes, what we call heresy is simply healing that came too soon. In the medieval world, the word surgery inspired dread rather than hope. Without anesthesia, antiseptics, or a real understanding of anatomy, operations were brutal affairs, equal parts endurance and improvisation. To go under the knife was a last resort, reserved only for the most desperate. Yet people did it. They lay down on wooden tables, clenched their jaws, and prayed, not for comfort, but for survival. Surgery in the Middle Ages was not a science. It was an ordeal. And for many, it was as dangerous as the disease it aimed to cure. The most common surgeries were those involving wounds, fractures, and abscesses. Battlefields and accidents produced a steady supply of patients with deep cuts, broken bones, and embedded arrows. Surgeons, often barbers by trade, were called upon to stitch flesh, set bones, or remove foreign objects. They worked quickly, with tools that were often rudimentary: knives, saws, hooks, and forceps. These instruments were rarely cleaned between uses. Blood dried on blades. Infection was almost inevitable. But speed was essential. The longer the procedure, the greater the pain and the risk. Amputations were among the most harrowing procedures. When a limb was crushed, gangrenous, or severely infected, cutting it off was the only chance at survival. The surgeon would tie a leather strap above the site to limit blood flow, then begin sawing through skin, muscle, and bone. There were no sedatives. The patient was held down by assistants, biting on leather or screaming into cloth. Once the limb was removed, the wound was cauterized with a red-hot iron. The smell of burning flesh filled the room. Some survived. Many did not. Even minor surgeries could end in death. Lancing a boil or draining an abscess might seem simple, but without sterile tools and proper aftercare, infection spread quickly. Internal surgeries, such as removing bladder stones or repairing hernias, were attempted only by the boldest surgeons. These procedures often caused more harm than good, rupturing organs or introducing fatal bacteria. Post-operative care was minimal. There were no antibiotics, no fluids, no sterile dressings, only prayers, poultices, and the strength of the patient's constitution. Pain management was rudimentary at best. Some surgeons used alcohol to dull the senses or opium in small quantities. Others relied on herbal sedatives like mandrake or henbane, though these were risky and could cause hallucinations or death in high doses. Most often, the patient was expected to endure the pain fully conscious. There was a cultural valorization of suffering, a belief that bearing agony without complaint was a form of spiritual strength. Screams were common, fainting frequent. The body was pushed to its very limits. Training for surgeons varied wildly. Some learned through apprenticeships, watching and assisting their masters. Others gained experience as military medics, patching up soldiers on the battlefield. Universities occasionally offered instruction, but surgery was considered a lowly profession, manual labor rather than intellectual pursuit. Physicians, who studied books and diagnosed illnesses, often looked down on surgeons. The separation between the two was stark. The doctor prescribed, the surgeon cut. It wasn't until centuries later that surgery would be elevated to a respected branch of medicine. Hospitals, such as they were, provided little in the way of surgical support. Most were operated by religious orders and focused on palliative care, comforting the sick, not curing them. Surgical procedures were more likely to occur in homes, battlefields, or barber shops. The cleanliness of the environment varied wildly. Flies buzzed around wounds. Tools were rinsed in dirty water or wiped on cloth aprons. There was no understanding of microbes, no sense of sterile fields. Survival often came down to luck or the strength of one's immune system. Despite these horrors, some surgeons became respected for their skill. Texts like the Chirurgia Magna by Guy de Chauliac offer detailed instructions on wound care and surgical techniques. These manuals combined ancient Roman knowledge with medieval observations, promoting cleanliness and anatomical accuracy where possible. Still, widespread literacy and access to these texts were rare. Most surgeons relied on tradition, trial and error, and gut instinct. Success stories were spread by word of mouth. Failures were buried quickly. Women occasionally participated in surgical care, especially in treating other women. Female surgeons and barber surgeons existed, particularly in urban centers, though they were often marginalized or forced to work under male relatives' names. They might assist in childbirth-related procedures or wound care, but rarely received formal recognition. Their knowledge was often practical and experience-based, drawn from years of tending to bodies in pain. Like midwives and herbalists, they walked a fine line, praised when helpful, punished when suspected of overstepping. Today, the idea of surgery evokes sterile rooms, careful monitoring, and trained professionals. But in the Middle Ages, to undergo surgery was to roll the dice. There was no assurance of survival, no guarantee of relief. It was a gamble made out of necessity, desperation, or unbearable pain. And yet, despite the crude tools and limited understanding, some patients did live. Some wounds healed. Some limbs were saved. It is a testament not only to human resilience, but to the strange and brutal beginnings of an art that would one day become a science. In the Middle Ages, cleanliness was not just undervalued, it was misunderstood. While we now associate hygiene with health, in medieval Europe, bathing was often viewed with suspicion, and cleanliness was not linked to disease prevention. Germs were unknown, soap was a luxury, and water, the most basic agent of hygiene, was often feared more than revered. As a result, filth was a constant companion to life and often a quiet killer. The absence of hygiene did not merely offend the senses. It laid the groundwork for infection, infestation, and early death. Bathing practices varied wildly across time and region. In early medieval periods, public bathhouses were relatively common, especially in cities with Roman heritage. But as the centuries progressed, particularly in Western Europe, attitudes shifted. Bathhouses became associated with sin, especially as they also became places for illicit activity. Church authorities warned that exposing the naked body invited temptation. By the late medieval period, regular bathing had become rare for many, especially the poor. People relied instead on washing hands and faces occasionally, or changing underclothes to absorb sweat and grime. Water itself was seen as potentially harmful. It was believed that warm water opened the pores, allowing disease to enter the body. Physicians warned against frequent immersion, especially during colder months. Those who did bathe were advised to do so quickly and under specific astrological conditions. Cleanliness was not seen as virtuous. In fact, saints and hermits were often celebrated for their filthy robes and unwashed bodies, as signs of piety and rejection of worldly vanity. Dirt, in some cases, was holiness, even when it masked the symptoms of disease. Tooth care was equally rudimentary. People might chew herbs like mint or fennel to freshen breath, or rub crushed sage and salt on their teeth. But toothbrushes and regular dental care were non-existent. Rotting teeth were common. Infections from abscessed gums could spread to the jaw or bloodstream. Halitosis was widespread. People lost teeth young, often from scurvy or decay. Toothache was a constant torment, and extractions were performed with pliers or brute force. Pain relief, if attempted, came from clove oil, alcohol, or simply enduring the agony. Sanitation in homes was minimal. Floors were often packed earth or wood strewn with straw. This straw absorbed waste, grease, and food scraps. Chamber pots were emptied into streets or nearby cesspits. In cities, human waste mingled with animal dung, rotting produce, and garbage. The stench was overwhelming. Rain might wash it away or carry it into drinking water. Flies, rats, and fleas thrived in such environments, bringing with them lice, typhus, and plague. The connection between this filth and illness was not understood. Bad smells, not bacteria, were blamed. The concept of a sewer system existed in some Roman-influenced cities, but maintenance was rare. Blocked drains overflowed. Open gutters ran beside marketplaces and homes. In rural areas, waste was simply buried, dumped in pits, or left in fields. People walked through muck daily. Children played in it. Food was prepared near it. There was no refrigeration. Spoiled meats and sour dairy were eaten out of necessity. Rotting food bred maggots and bacteria, leading to food poisoning and chronic digestive issues. Yet most people believed illness came from corrupted air, not contaminated conditions. Clothing rarely saw soap. Garments were worn until they were visibly filthy or infested. Lice and fleas were accepted as part of life. Nitpicking was a daily chore, and delousing one another was a social bonding activity. Bedding was rarely washed and often shared. Straw mattresses teemed with insects. Vermin crawled freely through homes and under floors. Skin diseases, rashes, boils, and scabs were common and untreated. Itching was a constant affliction. People scratched until they bled. Infections spread. And still, the underlying causes remained a mystery. Medical authorities offered limited guidance. Some recommended washing with vinegar or rosewater, but these were luxuries. Others believed that keeping clean was unnatural, especially during illness. Patients were often forbidden to bathe while sick, for fear of weakening the body or disturbing the humors. Instead, sickness was masked with perfumes and herbal sachets. Clean-smelling air was thought to fight disease better than soap and water. Even doctors rarely washed their hands between patients. The idea that invisible pathogens could travel from skin to skin had yet to be imagined. Women, tasked with maintaining the household, bore the brunt of hygiene efforts. They boiled linens when they could, scrubbed floors with lye, and hung garments in the sun to kill pests. But soap was homemade and expensive. Water had to be fetched from wells or rivers. Laundry days were exhausting, and clean clothes were quickly soiled again. In wealthier homes, servants managed these tasks. In poor homes, cleanliness was always just beyond reach. A clean child was a rare sight. A clean house, almost mythic. Looking back, it's easy to shudder at these conditions. But it's also important to remember that the people of the Middle Ages were not lazy or indifferent. They simply lacked the tools of understanding we now take for granted. Today, we wash our hands without thinking, flush waste with a button, and eat from sanitized surfaces. But these comforts were built on generations of trial, error, and suffering. The medieval world was not just dirty, it was deadly because it was dirty. And from that filth, we eventually learned to value the gift of being clean. In a world already fraught with the dangers of acute disease and violent death, to live with a chronic illness or disability in the Middle Ages was to inhabit a fragile body in a society with little support and less understanding. There were no crutches as we know them, no wheelchairs, no physical therapy. Pain was endured, not treated. Mobility impairments, sensory disorders, and lifelong illnesses were often met with a mixture of pity, suspicion, and spiritual speculation. A broken body was not just a physical reality. It was often seen as a moral or cosmic judgment. Chronic conditions like arthritis, epilepsy, gout, or tuberculosis were all too common, yet lacked effective treatment. An elderly farmer whose joints had stiffened from years of labor might be forced into early retirement, unable to contribute to his household. A young woman with a persistent cough might slowly fade over years, her strength ebbing away with each season. Without diagnosis or medical explanation, these lingering illnesses were often attributed to imbalanced humors or divine punishment. Suffering was seen as a test of faith, or more cruelly, a sign of corruption within the soul. Those born with physical deformities or neurological differences faced particular challenges. A child born with a malformed limb or cleft palate was seen through the lens of omen and superstition. In some regions, such children were believed to be changelings, swapped by fairies, or marked by the devil. Families might hide them, abandon them, or send them to monasteries. If the child survived, they might grow into adulthood under a cloud of fear and exclusion. There was little accommodation. The world made no effort to meet them halfway. Mobility issues were often devastating. A person with a badly healed leg fracture or spinal injury might become entirely dependent on others. Crude walking sticks or carts might be fashioned, but movement remained slow and painful. Roads were treacherous. Stairs were common. Homes were cramped and uneven. Many with mobility impairments were confined to their immediate surroundings for life. Some ended up as beggars, sitting on church steps or at city gates, reliant on the charity of strangers and exposed to the elements. Blindness, whether from birth or illness, was met with a complex blend of reverence and rejection. On one hand, blind individuals were sometimes thought to possess deeper spiritual insight. Stories of prophets and saints lent credence to the idea that lacking physical sight heightened one's connection to the divine. On the other, the blind were often impoverished, relegated to singing or reciting prayers for coins. There were no braille systems, no formal education. A blind person could not read, navigate independently, or easily contribute to labor. Their survival depended on familial support or the goodwill of the church. Deafness was less understood and more isolating. In a world that relied heavily on oral communication and had no standardized sign language, the deaf were often seen as unreachable or even unintelligent. Many were thought to be mute as well, and their silence was misinterpreted as vacancy of mind. They were excluded from religious rituals that depended on speech and listening. Even those with partial hearing loss faced great difficulty. Without amplification devices, the world grew dimmer with each passing year, and with it, social connection eroded. Mental disabilities, both congenital and acquired, were among the most harshly treated. Individuals with cognitive differences were often labeled fools or simpletons, mocked in literature and feared in real life. While a few were sheltered within monasteries or allowed to remain in their communities as harmless eccentrics, many more were abandoned, abused, or imprisoned. Those who displayed aggressive behavior or failed to follow social norms were seen as dangerous or possessed. Their lives were short, filled with confusion and neglect. Compassion, where it existed, was inconsistent and often uninformed. Some chronic conditions stemmed from work-related injuries. Years of lifting, bending, hammering, or plowing took a toll. There were no ergonomic tools, no knowledge of repetitive strain injuries. A blacksmith with a shattered shoulder, a washerwoman with collapsed vertebrae, these were not unusual. Such individuals might try to keep working, but when pain grew unbearable or movement failed, they faded from the workforce. There were no pensions, no disability benefits. Work until you could not, and then hope that someone would feed you. Religious institutions played a complicated role. Monasteries and convents sometimes took in the disabled and chronically ill, offering food, shelter, and basic care. Pilgrimage sites like Lourdes or Canterbury attracted thousands hoping for miraculous cures. Saints were invoked, relics were touched. But such care, while often sincere, was spiritual rather than medical. The root of the suffering was rarely addressed. The Church taught that pain might purify the soul, that suffering drew one closer to God. And so the disabled were both tended to and left in their affliction comforted, but not healed. In today's world, we recognize disability as part of human diversity. We offer accommodations, assistive technologies, and inclusive education. But in the Middle Ages, a broken body meant a life on the margins. Survival depended on the kindness of family or the charity of strangers. There was no dignity built into the system because there was no system at all. And yet, in this brutal world, many endured. They created lives within the limitations, found community where they could, and faced each day with a courage that has too often gone unrecognized in the stories we tell of the past. In the Middle Ages, to leave one's village was to embrace uncertainty and possibly death. The modern idea of travel as a leisure activity or a routine business trip simply didn't exist. Roads were dangerous, maps were crude or non-existent, and those who ventured beyond familiar paths did so at great personal risk. Whether traveling for trade, pilgrimage, or necessity, each journey was a wager against bandits, disease, injury, and the elements. To travel was to gamble with your life, and many never returned home. Most medieval people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace. Villages were isolated by forests, rivers, and political boundaries. Even the next town over could feel like another world. When travel became necessary, perhaps for a fair, a wedding, a pilgrimage to a holy site, or military service, preparation was minimal. There were no passports or secure accommodations. Travelers often went on foot, sleeping outdoors or begging for shelter. Wealthier individuals might ride horseback or hire a cart, but even that offered little protection from the hazards ahead. The roads themselves were in poor condition. In some places, Roman roads still existed, worn but passable. Elsewhere, dirt paths turned to rivers of mud in the rain and dust in the sun. Potholes could twist ankles or snap wagon wheels. Bridges were rare and dangerous, often narrow, rickety, or simply non-existent. Fording rivers was perilous. Strong currents, hidden rocks, and sudden floods claimed many lives. A single misstep could mean drowning, especially for those traveling with animals or heavy goods. Bandits were a constant threat. With little law enforcement outside of city walls, the countryside teemed with opportunists. Lone travelers or small groups were easy targets. Robbers might strip them of everything: money, food, shoes, even clothing. Resistance was often met with violence. Some bandits were desperate peasants. Others were rogue knights or mercenaries between wars. Stories of ambushes and roadside killings spread from town to town. The mere rumor of a bandit in the woods could keep a whole village homebound for weeks. Travelers who avoided violence still faced exposure to disease and injury. Blisters could become infected. Cold nights brought frostbite. Sleeping on damp ground encouraged pneumonia. Cuts and scrapes from falls or brambles might fester. Malaria, typhus, and other diseases followed trade routes and clustered around busy way stations. Pilgrims, in particular, were prone to illness from poor sanitation and shared accommodations. The communal nature of travel meant that if one person fell ill, many others would soon follow. Contagion was an invisible companion on every road. Food and clean water were not guaranteed. Travelers brought what provisions they could carry, often bread, dried meat, and a flask of weak ale or wine. Water from streams was unfiltered and often contaminated. Hunger was a constant threat, especially on longer journeys. Foraging was risky: wild berries, might be poisonous, mushrooms fatal. Inns, when available, were expensive and sometimes unsafe. Many travelers relied on the charity of strangers, monasteries, or churches. Refusal of hospitality could mean starvation. Acceptance sometimes meant exposure to theft or worse. Even the animals that aided travel added risk. Horses could go lame or throw their riders. Carts might overturn on steep paths. Oxen and mules were slow and difficult to control. A lost animal could strand a traveler in the wilderness. Wild beasts, bears, wolves, boars roamed freely in some regions. Though human threats were more common, nature had teeth too. A single injury from an animal attack might prove fatal, not from the wound itself, but from infection or the inability to reach help in time. Religious travelers faced unique dangers. Pilgrimages were often long, sometimes crossing countries and kingdoms. While some were inspired by deep faith, others went in search of healing, forgiveness, or escape. Along the way, pilgrims wore badges identifying their destination: Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, Jerusalem, but these also marked them as outsiders and targets. Pilgrim routes could be crowded and unsanitary. Groups offered some protection, but they also slowed progress and attracted thieves. A pilgrimage, while holy, was not necessarily safe. Women faced compounded risks. Alone or even in groups, they were vulnerable to assault, harassment, and abandonment. Some disguised themselves as men for protection. Others traveled with armed escorts, if they could afford it. But most walked the road in fear, trusting in prayers and luck. Tales of miraculous escapes and saintly interventions filled medieval texts. But behind these stories was the harsh reality. For a woman, every step beyond her home was a step into danger. And yet, people still traveled. Merchants sought profit. Pilgrims sought redemption. Soldiers followed banners into unfamiliar lands. Messengers rode for kings. Curiosity, necessity, and devotion called people from their hearths into the wide, unforgiving world. Every journey was a story. Every return, a small miracle. In a time before timetables and travel insurance, the road was a place of risk and transformation. And for those who braved it, survival was not just a matter of distance, but of resilience, faith, and extraordinary luck. In medieval Europe, faith was the foundation of daily life, shaping laws, social roles, and even the rhythms of the seasons. The church offered spiritual guidance, solace, and a moral compass, but it also held immense power, both sacred and secular. That power was not always benign. While religion gave meaning to suffering, it could also inflict suffering. People lived in fear not only of hell, but of the very institutions that promised to save their souls. And at times, death came not from disease or war, but from belief itself misplaced, misunderstood, or manipulated. One of the most chilling examples was the Inquisition, a series of church-led campaigns to root out heresy. To question official doctrine was to risk torture, imprisonment, or execution. Accusations often arose from rumor or personal vendettas. A misunderstood comment, an unusual interpretation of Scripture, or even failure to attend Mass could arouse suspicion. Trials were rarely fair. Confessions were extracted under duress, and once labeled a heretic, a person was often beyond saving. Some were burned alive, others exiled, their names erased from family and community. Public executions for heresy served as brutal lessons. Crowds gathered to witness these punishments, not always out of cruelty, but because such events were framed as divine justice. A burning was not just a death, it was a spectacle of purification, a performance of moral order. Victims were paraded through the streets, sometimes gagged to prevent final words that might sow doubt. Their belongings were confiscated, their families shamed. The fire did not only consume bodies, it cauterized dissent, searing obedience into the hearts of those who watched. Even outside formal accusations, religious belief could be fatal. Flagellants, who marched from town to town whipping themselves as penance during the Black Death, spread not only fear but disease. Some believed they could atone for the sins of mankind through pain, drawing crowds, and sometimes inciting panic. The Church, at first supportive, later banned them as dangerous radicals. Their faith was sincere, but their actions sometimes led to chaos, outbreaks, and violence. In this age, zeal was both admired and feared, a fine line separated devotion from madness. For Jews, Muslims, and other non-Christians, faith was often a death sentence in itself. In times of crisis, plague, famine, or religious minorities were scapegoated, accused of poisoning wells, angering God, or corrupting the faithful. Entire communities were massacred or expelled. The pogroms that swept through Europe left thousands dead and many more displaced. Synagogues were burned, sacred texts destroyed. Forced conversions were common, and those who refused faced exile or execution. Faith, when divergent, became a mark of danger rather than identity. The concept of martyrdom added another layer of complexity. Saints and martyrs were revered for dying in defense of the faith, their deaths seen as triumphs rather than tragedies. Hagiographies, biographies of saints, were filled with tales of individuals who chose lions, fire, or swords over renouncing Christ. These stories inspired generations, but they also normalized suffering and death as holy pursuits. People were taught not only to live righteously, but to die willingly if called upon. In a world already rife with hardship, such ideals could be both uplifting and deadly. Pilgrimage, a deeply spiritual act, was also riddled with danger. While the goal was sacred, reaching the shrine of a saint, walking in the footsteps of Christ, the journey could be fatal. Pilgrims faced thieves, illness, and starvation. Some never returned. Others brought back diseases to their home villages. Yet these journeys were encouraged, even mandated, as penance or obligation. A vow made in sickness might bind a man to a journey he could not survive. Faith compelled many to walk toward death in hopes of eternal life. Religious relics, believed to hold healing or protective powers, also sparked perilous behaviors. In some towns, competing claims over a saint's bones led to riots. Processions carrying relics through plague-ridden streets were meant to drive away disease, but often became super-spreader events. People flocked to touch, kiss, or pray beside these sacred objects, packed tightly in unventilated churches. Their faith was genuine. Their hope was desperate. But their actions, unknowingly, worsened the very suffering they sought to end. Women, especially those drawn to spiritual roles outside traditional paths, paid a high price for their piety. Visionaries, mystics, and anchoresses women, who secluded themselves in cells to pray, were both admired and monitored. A woman who claimed divine visions walked a razor's edge. If her revelations aligned with church doctrine, she might be canonized. If they diverged, she risked condemnation. Joan of Arc, a peasant girl guided by heavenly voices, led armies, but was burned as a heretic when her usefulness waned. Faith, for women, was always under suspicion. And yet, in the heart of this danger, belief endured. People lit candles in chapels, whispered prayers at gravesides, and sang hymns in the face of death. Faith provided structure to the chaos, meaning to the suffering, and hope beyond the grave. But it also demanded obedience, conformity, and sometimes blood. In the Middle Ages, belief was not a private matter. It was a force that shaped destiny. And for many, the path to salvation passed through fire, chains, and silence. The soul was eternal, yes, but the body, and the world it moved through, could pay dearly for its convictions. Before the discovery of germs, before microscopes revealed the invisible battleground inside our bodies, people believed that death traveled through the air, not as microbes, but as smells. This was the foundation of the miasma theory, the idea that foul odors cause disease. Rotting garbage, swamp gases, the breath of the sick, even the stench of sin itself. These were thought to carry illness directly into the lungs. And so, in the Middle Ages, people feared not what they could not see, but what they could smell. Disease, they believed, had a scent and it was always nearby. The miasma theory wasn't born from foolishness. It was the best explanation people had. They noticed that outbreaks of disease often followed foul conditions: unburied corpses, stagnant water, open sewers. And so they drew a line between odor and illness. The air was blamed for pestilence. Breezes from the south were deemed dangerous. Fog was seen as suspicious. A change in wind could mean a change in health. It made a strange sort of sense. When the plague came, it came with rot. When people died, they reeked. To medieval minds, smell and sickness were inseparable. This belief shaped public health in curious ways. Towns tried to combat disease by cleaning up smells, not pathogens. During the Black Death, people walked the streets carrying nosegays, bundles of fragrant herbs and flowers pressed to their noses. Wealthier citizens kept pomanders, small metal orbs filled with spices and perfumes, dangling from chains at their waists. Physicians donned the infamous plague masks, with long beak-like noses stuffed with strong-smelling substances to purify the air they breathed. The masks looked terrifying, but to their wearers, they were life-saving armor. Homes were fumigated with burning herbs, and church bells were rung to disperse the bad air. Streets were sprinkled with vinegar or lime. In extreme cases, entire neighborhoods were burned to rid them of the poisoned air. Ventilation was paradoxically discouraged in some instances, especially at night. Windows were kept shut to keep out death-bearing breezes. People believed that night air was especially dangerous. Sleep, already a vulnerable state, became more fraught when wrapped in untrusted winds. If the air turned foul, health turned with it. The sick were often isolated not just for contagion, but because their stench was feared. A feverish body, sweating through infected wounds, was thought to produce deadly exhalations. Rooms were filled with incense, rosemary, or lavender. Visitors held cloths to their faces. Even the dying were perfumed in hopes of purifying the soul and the room around them. Burial grounds were treated with caution, and the smell of decay was seen not just as unpleasant, but dangerous. Graveyards were often placed on the outskirts of towns, not for sanitation, but to protect the living from poisoned air. This theory extended into daily life in subtle ways. Personal hygiene was seen not as a health practice, but as an olfactory one. People bathed rarely, but might change underclothes or scent their garments. Illnesses were associated with class because the poor smelled worse, their bodies unwashed, their homes crowded and fetid. The assumption followed. Bad air followed bad people. This gave a moral weight to disease, reinforcing the belief that the impure and unclean were more vulnerable. Sickness was not just physical, it was social and spiritual. Miasma theory also influenced urban planning. Some cities widened streets to improve airflow. Open spaces and parks were praised not just for beauty, but for health. Sewers were dug not to remove germs, but to eliminate smells. Entire neighborhoods were relocated after outbreaks, based on prevailing winds. Hospitals were built on hills to escape low, thicker air. The placement of buildings, the arrangement of rooms, even the height of ceilings were shaped by this invisible fear. Fresh air was medicine, but only if it was unscented and clean. Even treatments reflected this belief. Patients were given aromatic poultices, made to inhale steam, infused with herbs, or advised to sleep near fragrant flowers. Illness was thought to leave the body through sweat, breath, and waste. The more one purged these elements, the better. The air around the patient had to be managed, controlled, purified. Fires were kept burning not for warmth, but to cleanse the atmosphere. In some cases, animals were blamed for fouling the air and driven from cities en masse. Cats, dogs, even birds were slaughtered to restore purity. Yet despite its flaws, the miasma theory wasn't entirely without merit. In focusing on cleanliness and air quality, it inadvertently led to real improvements. Removing filth, draining swamps, and improving airflow did reduce disease, though not for the reasons people believed. It was only in the 19th century, with the work of scientists like Pasteur and Snore, that germ theory replaced miasma. Only then did people understand that the danger was not in the air smell, but in the tiny organisms too small to see or scent. But for centuries, death in the Middle Ages was inhaled, feared with every breath. People held their breath near the sick, crossed the street to avoid odors, and stuffed their noses with flowers. Their world was thick with smells of sweat, decay, smoke, and sewage, and everyone might be the harbinger of plague. And though they were wrong about the mechanism, they were right to be afraid. For in those heavy, bitter winds, death did ride, just not in the way they thought. In the medieval mind, the boundaries between medicine and magic were porous. When illness struck, it wasn't simply a matter of failing flesh. It was an assault on the spiritual, moral, and cosmic order. Without modern science to explain the causes of disease, people turned to rituals, charms, and sacred objects as much as herbs or surgery. Healing was an act of faith, and faith, when misapplied or misunderstood, could lead to disaster. In the Middle Ages, superstition wasn't a fringe practice. It was part of the everyday fabric of survival. At the heart of this worldview was the belief that the body was governed not just by physical forces, but by spiritual ones. Sickness could be the result of sin, curses, or demonic interference. A sudden fever might be seen as divine punishment. A seizure could signal possession. In such cases, treatment didn't come from the doctor's apothecary, but from the priest's altar. Holy water, blessed relics, and whispered prayers were the medicine of choice. The church was both hospital and courtroom diagnosing, judging, and when it could, absolving. Talismans and amulets were common forms of protection. People wore crosses, saint medallions, and rings inscribed with prayers or sacred symbols. Certain stones were believed to ward off illness: amber for fevers, coral for bleeding, sapphire for ulcers. These objects weren't mere decorations. They were shields against invisible forces. Mothers hung charms above cradles. Travelers carried tokens to guard against plague. If a charm failed, it wasn't discarded, it was said to have absorbed the sickness, sparing the wearer. In a world ruled by uncertainty, such symbols offered comfort, if not cure. Astrology, too, played a major role in diagnosis and treatment. The stars were seen as guides to the body's balance and fate. Physicians often consulted celestial charts before administering care. They believed the moon influenced bodily fluids, that Mars governed blood, and that certain planetary alignments made surgery more dangerous. A physician might delay bleeding a patient until the moon left a certain phase, or avoid treating a specific ailment under a particular zodiac sign. This blending of cosmic and corporeal knowledge shaped not only medicine, but calendars and rituals. Bloodletting itself, though based on the ancient theory of humors, was as much a ritual as a medical procedure. It required precise timing, specific veins, and an almost ceremonial setup. The tools were kept with care. The patient was prepared with incantations and sometimes fasting. The belief wasn't just that the blood carried sickness, but that letting it go in a controlled way would reset the body's balance. This practice was deeply symbolic, a purification, a sacrifice, a way of releasing both illness and spiritual impurity into the world. Certain numbers and words were believed to hold healing power. The number 3, symbolic of the Trinity, appeared in many remedies. Herbs mixed in threes, treatments repeated 3 times, prayers said thrice. Some believed that speaking specific words aloud, even nonsense syllables passed down through oral tradition, could ward off disease. These charms were whispered over the sick, etched into walls, and carried on scraps of parchment. Their power lay not in the ingredients, but in the belief that language itself could shape reality. Exorcisms were among the most extreme forms of medical superstition. When someone displayed signs of what we might now call mental illness, hallucinations, convulsions, sudden mood changes, they were sometimes believed to be possessed. The exorcist, often a priest, would confront the demon with prayers, relics, and holy symbols. These rituals were dramatic, emotional, and dangerous. Some sufferers were tied down, deprived of food, or subjected to physical abuse. Whether they emerged cured or traumatized, the ritual served the community as a demonstration of faith and order restored. Wells, groves, and springs believed to have healing properties became pilgrimage sites. People traveled long distances to drink or bathe in waters said to cure blindness, paralysis, or infertility. Often these places were tied to legends of saints or miracles, places where blood had been spilled or where visions had appeared. Pilgrims left offerings, coins, cloth, locks of hair. These sacred places became both hospitals and holy ground, reinforcing the idea that healing came not through medicine alone, but through proximity to the divine. When disease became widespread during plagues or famines, rituals expanded to entire communities. Processions marched through cities carrying relics, chanting prayers, and sprinkling holy water. Church bells tolled constantly. Statues were carried through streets. People wore sackcloth and ashes, whipped themselves in penance, or fasted in hopes of divine mercy. These public acts were meant to purify the community, drive away the spirits of sickness, and restore God's favor. Even when ineffective, they provided a sense of shared purpose and collective action. In hindsight, many of these practices seem futile, even cruel, but to those who lived them, they were lifelines. In the absence of germ theory, antibiotics, or reliable treatment, the body became a battlefield of faith, fear, and hope. Superstition filled the vacuum of knowledge. It gave meaning to suffering, structure to chaos, and ritual to the randomness of death. And though we now see these beliefs as outdated, they remind us that medicine has always been more than science. It is also story, symbol, and the search for control in a world too vast to fully understand. For thousands of years, humankind walked hand in hand with suffering. A scratch could be a death sentence. A fever, a funeral. People lived not with the question of if they would get sick, but when and whether their bodies would endure it. But in the past 2 centuries, something extraordinary happened. Knowledge deepened. Tools sharpened. Microscopes revealed what prayers and potions could not. Modern medicine emerged not with fanfare, but through the patient, painstaking work of observation, experimentation, and compassion. And in doing so, it transformed what it means to live. The story begins with a simple yet profound idea, that illness has cause, not divine punishment, not bad air, but tangible, observable agents: bacteria, viruses, parasites. With Louis Pasteur's germ theory in the 19th century, the world's understanding of disease changed forever. Suddenly, invisible forces could be seen. They had shape, behavior, vulnerability. Once identified, they could be fought. This knowledge didn't just improve medicine, it revolutionized it. It moved the focus from superstition to science, from ritual to reason, and in doing so, it saved millions of lives. Antibiotics followed. Penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, was the first of many weapons against bacterial infections that once ravaged communities. Conditions like strep throat, pneumonia, and tuberculosis, once near certain death sentences, became manageable, even curable. Surgeries that had been reckless and desperate now became planned, sterile, and survivable. The introduction of anesthesia meant that patients could sleep through procedures once endured awake. Pain, long accepted as a fact of life, was finally challenged. Suffering became optional. That was a radical shift. Vaccines, too, reshaped human fate. Smallpox, the great killer of kings and peasants alike, was eradicated in 1980 thanks to global vaccination efforts. Polio, which once paralyzed children by the thousands, has been nearly wiped out. Measles, mumps, rubella diseases that once filled graveyards with small coffins are now preventable with a single shot. Immunization turned the tide not just against death, but against fear. It made childhood safe again. It gave parents something medieval people never had, the ability to protect their children before danger arrived. Hygiene evolved from superstition to science. Sanitation systems were developed. Clean water became a priority. Hand washing, once dismissed, became a cornerstone of medical practice, thanks to pioneers like Ignaz Semmelweis and Florence Nightingale. Hospitals adopted sterile procedures. Tools were cleaned, rooms ventilated, linens laundered. The very air around us became safer. Childbirth transformed from a leading cause of death into a carefully managed process. Life expectancy soared. In the span of a few generations, we went from fearing a sneeze to surviving open-heart surgery. Diagnostics changed the game even further. Blood tests, X-rays, MR, as these tools allowed doctors to peer inside the body without cutting it open. Illness could be caught early, monitored precisely, treated specifically. No longer were healers guessing based on symptoms and star charts. They had data, patterns, images. A cough could be tracked, a tumor seen, a heartbeat recorded. The body, once a mystery, became a readable text. And the doctor became not a mystic or a butcher, but a skilled interpreter of signs and systems. Access to care expanded. While inequality still persists, the 20th and 21st centuries saw the rise of public health systems, emergency services, and global aid networks. Vaccines reached remote villages. Mobile clinics brought medicine to underserved regions. Telemedicine now connects doctors and patients across continents. What was once a privilege is increasingly seen as a right. The idea that a person, regardless of wealth, should not die from preventable illness is a profound moral evolution, one that medieval minds could scarcely have imagined. Mental health, too, has emerged from the shadows. Conditions once blamed on demons or sin are now understood as disorders of the brain, treatable with therapy, medication, and support. Depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, these are no longer death sentences or social exiles. Though stigma remains, compassion grows. We have learned that the mind is not separate from the body, and that both deserve care. To be unwell is no longer to be unworthy. That, too, is a kind of healing. Still, the ghosts of the past linger. Vaccine hesitancy, medical misinformation, and healthcare inequality remind us that progress is not guaranteed. The pandemics of our own age echo the plagues of the past, but we now face them with tools forged in centuries of struggle. We have antibiotics, ventilators, data sharing, and above all, knowledge. Death still walks among us, but no longer unchallenged. We have learned to fight. We have learned to care. And in doing so, we've changed the world. When we look back on the medieval world, its agony, its helplessness, its rituals and rot, it's easy to feel removed. But we carry its memory in our cells, our stories, our medical textbooks. Every pill swallowed, every wound stitched, every life saved is a quiet miracle built on the bones of those who came before. They walked through fire without understanding. We walk with light, and in that light, we honor them, not by forgetting how they died, but by remembering how we learned to live.